And we're live. Well, welcome back to the Bells Club podcast. I'm your host, David Bell. And on today's episode, we'll be taking a look at round 12 of the 2025 Formula 1 World Championship, with this week's Grand Prix being held at the legendary Silverstone Circuit for the British Grand Prix. So let's get ready for those 5 green lights and we'll be underway. So we're going to take a look at FP1 and FP2 first for the British Grand Prix. So the same as in Austria, we did see a few new faces in the car this week. Now, to be fair, it's not a bad weekend for some new upcoming talent to have some time in the car. But down in Red Bull, Arvid Lindblad in place of Yuki Tsunoda. Then over at Sauber, we saw Paul Aron replacing Nico Hülkenberg for the first practice session. So there's some new info for, well, me at least this weekend, as I heard that there are some rumours that Alpine are considering replacing Colapinto with Valtteri Bottas, who, I was under the impression that Bottas was in contention for one of the seats over at Cadillac, but Alpine, really? At the end of the day, a seat in fucking Formula 1 is a seat in Formula 1, so I don't see why Valtteri wouldn't want to take the opportunity to get back into the sport and dive in even at the team who is doing the shittest, if you will, in this year's championship, as them are 10th in the leaderboards. Now, at around the 21-minute mark, a yellow flag was waved as Bortoleto spun his car. It looked like he spun around like 3 times on the exit of Copse. Now, he wasn't the only driver to have issues in Copse, Maggots, Beckett's, Chapel kind of area, but he did manage to run wide onto the curbing and lose traction of the rear end of his car, and he did spin out, unfortunately. But luckily, it looked like he only flat spotted his tyres, and there was no other major issues, so he was able to return back to the pits, throw a new set of tyres on, and continue the session. Then, at the end of the first practice session, our fastest 3 drivers of the session were Hamilton in P1, Norris in P2, then Piastri in P3. So now that FP1 is kind of out of the way, we can have a look at FP2 now. So after a spin, Carlos Sainz was actually noted for rejoining the track unsafely by the stewards, but we found out, or we were kind of prompted later in the session, that no further investigation or no further action was needed for that particular incident. Now, the FP2 session itself was one of the more quieter sessions. Even the actual commentators themselves were kind of talking about just chatting shit about just random shite, really. But at the end of the session, we did see, again, our 3 fastest drivers, those being Norris in P1, and our boys in red with Leclerc in P2 and Hamilton in P3. So we're going to move on to the Saturday now, have a look at FP3 and Grand Prix qualifying. So now we're going to dive into the Saturday, or FP3 first. So the actual third practice session was delayed by about 5 minutes, as the marshals needed to remove some extra rubber, some gravel off the track. They basically needed a bit of extra time, as the Formula 1 actually had some historical cars driving around the track. I think Zach Brown was actually one of the participants in that kind of session, if you will, where he was driving around one of the old Williams, which belonged to Nigel Mansell. I think it was one of his championship-winning cars. So I'm sure that even though he's the boss of McLaren, I'm sure it was just a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to drive one of the old legends, Nigel Mansell's car, around Silverstone. So they just needed a bit of time to remove all the garbage that they caused off the track. Then the same as FP2, it was one of the more quieter sessions through the kind of the bulk of it, say the first 10 minutes, the last 10 minutes, so like 40-odd minutes, 50-odd minutes, was kind of boring, if you will. But towards the end of the session, say again within the last 10 minutes or so, as Hamilton was setting a purple Sector 1 and green in Sector 2, a yellow flag unfortunately was waved as a piece of carbon fibre was spotted on the track, which of course needed to be removed by the trackside marshals before it caused any other damage to not only Hamilton's car but all the other 20 drivers on the track. Then it was actually kind of rewind back on the broadcast cameras that we saw, or well, probably the broadcasters, and then shown to us, that the actual carbon had came off Ollie Berman's car. Then at the end of FP3, like literally within only like a minute or so left, Bortoleto, unfortunately, again, did lose control of his car and went spinning over curbings, over bumps in the grass, and he did smash up the front left suspension. But luckily, he did manage to get the actual car settled in the gravel. That's kind of the whole reason for a gravel trap to be there, to slow the car down before it actually made contact with the barriers. Now, thankfully, because of the gravel trap, he didn't actually hit the barrier, because the gravel trap did its job and slowed his car down. And then, while coming back into the pits after Bortoleto's crash, Ollie Berman had a decent lockup under braking, and he crashed into the barriers. But the crash itself wasn't that bad, if you will. It only really smashed up his front wing, which was easily replaced. But unfortunately, because of that crash, he did receive a 10-place grid penalty and 4 points on his super license. And for a rookie, that's not how you kind of want to start your F1 career. Yes, shit happens, but again, it's easily avoidable. Then, after Bortoleto's crash, that basically brought an end to third practice. So, at the end of the actual session, our final three fastest drivers were Leclerc in P1, Piastri in P2, then Verstappen in P3. So, now that all the practice sessions are out of the way for the British Grand Prix, we can move on to the more intense stuff now. So, mainly qualifying. So, starting off in Q1, that's when we actually were told about the penalties that Ollie Berman would receive in terms of his 10-place grid penalty and those 4 points on his license. But during the session itself, say around halfway through the session, a yellow flag was actually waved as Carlo Pinto put both of his front and left wheels, or both left, front and rear wheels, Jesus Christ, on the painted part of the curbing at turn 18. Now, in doing so, he did lose traction of his car and spin out, and he did manage to settle into the barrier, settle into the gravel, should I say, but he did end up hitting the barrier. The gravel traps are kind of notorious for beaching cars and them not being able to move. The driver has to just jump out of it. But with this crash, Carlo Pinto was somehow managed to get his car moving again and bring it back to the pits. But from the actual broadcast cameras, we saw there was a lot of vibration happening in his car, and that was evident by just looking at his rear wing. It was just vibrating like your typical vibrator, if you will. And then the flag itself was later upgraded into a full red flag, as we saw Carlo Pinto had to pull off to the side of the track, kind of just after the pit exit, and that unfortunately ended Carlo Pinto's quali session and immediately started him in P20 for the race on Sunday. Then at the actual end of Q1, we did lose our first 5 drivers, those being Lawson, Bortoleto, Stroll, Hulkenberg, and again, Carlo Pinto. So in qualifying 2, or Q2 now, so within the first half of that second quali session, Ferrari themselves then ended up dropping down into the elimination zone because of just straight up just shit laps, just slow lap times. But it seems like they did. The question was, with their kind of slow lap times, did they back off for whatever reason? Did they want to change something in their setup? Or what was going on during the session? During the first half of the session. But in the end, if they kind of backed off or not, it frankly doesn't matter. Because we obviously wanted to see Hamilton on pole, Leclerc on pole, Charles on pole. But again, at the end of the day, it didn't really matter, because they did put in decent lap times to get them through to Q3. And I say they did put together some decent lap times. They actually went P1 and P2, but unfortunately, it was only in Q2. But at the end of the session, we did end up losing our last 5 drivers, those being Sainz, Tsunoda, Hadjar, Albon, and Ocon. Then following into Q3 now. So in the first half of Q3, we actually saw Hamilton in P2, but Leclerc was down in P5. Yes, now that was amazing to see Hamilton up as far as he was, but Leclerc could obviously improve upon that. When they did set those lap times, there was around 4-ish minutes or so left, so there was plenty of time to get 1 or 2 more laps in before the checker flag. Now, after they did get their last well, I say last 1 or 2 laps in. Each team only managed to get only one in, just with the way the actual timing worked. But unfortunately, we did see Ferrari drop back down to P5 and P6. So they have a decent amount of work to do on the Sunday. So there's always hope. There's always possibility of the win. And kind of it's going to, don't know if it's going to be spoilers now, but if you kind of watch the race, you'll see how it ended up for Ferrari on the Sunday. But for the third time at Silverstone, Max Verstappen takes pole for the British Grand Prix. Now he is followed up on the front rows by Piastri in P2, Norris in P3, and Russell in P4. So we're going to head now to look at Sunday for the Grand Prix itself. And now we're going to have a look at Sunday now for the race itself, or the British Grand Prix. So before the race even started itself, we did see a few changes to the starting grid, with Colapinto actually having to start from the pit lane. Now this was due to him having to replace or change his power unit. Now Ollie Berman had to start in 18th due to the red flag infringement during the qualifying session. Then Kimi Antonelli actually had to start in 10th, as he did receive a 3-place grid penalty for the crash he caused back in Austria, as we've seen from when he just racked out Max. Now, only after, say, 3 or 4 corners, we saw in the background of the broadcast cameras that the racing bull of Liam Lawson was heading straight into the gravel. It was kind of funny. You just see him going from the right of the screen, 150 mile an hour across to the left-hand side of the screen. But the actual marshals themselves had to wave the yellow flag, but that was later then upgraded to a VSC, or virtual safety car, as the incident actually happened between Lawson and Ocon, as Ocon actually ended up being sandwiched between Yuki and Lawson. Lawson just turned straight in for the corner and made heavy contact with Ocon, which ended up ending Lawson's race. Now, after the actual formation lap, Colapinto, actually we seen him had to drive back into the pits to change his tyres, but during the stop he did unfortunately stall his car, and even from his team radio or the commentators that noticed or told us about, that his car was actually stuck in second gear, so Alpine unfortunately had to retire the car from the race. Now, every race weekend, it's looking more and more likely that, even from what the kind of rumours were and with what we actually saw this weekend, it is looking more and more likely that Bottas is going to end up replacing Colapinto, because he just keeps making too many mistakes, which God knows how much money that's costing Alpine, millions every weekend, due to either him crashing out, having to repair his car, or even in the prize money at the end of the year. It's only Gasly's kind of carrying the team, kind of collecting points, actually putting points towards the constructors. You kind of can't do that with a one-sided team. Yes, Red Bull are doing it because they've got a 4-time world champion in Max Verstappen. He's arguably the best driver on the grid right now. That's how he's able to carry his team. But I would not be surprised before the end of the season we saw Colapinto get dropped and little old Bottas come back into the seat, and we finally see him back on the grid again. Then on lap 4, as the track still wasn't 100% dry, Bortoleto lost the back end of his car and spun off into the barriers. Now, the actual crash smashed up his front wing, not his front wing, it smashed up his rear wing, and that unfortunately, because you can't repair a rear wing during the race, that ended up ending his race then and there. Then there was kind of nothing really happened for the first or the next 10-ish laps. But then on lap 14, we actually saw a full safety car deployed, as they wanted to slow the cars down, as the rain was actually getting quite heavy, or was getting heavier. And with heavy rain, standing water, that's how you get close to hydroplane territory. And obviously you don't want that. Cars hydroplane go crashing straight into each other, crash into the barriers, ending races, or potentially ending drivers, which unfortunately is something that I don't like to say will happen, but it's a possibility in this sport. But obviously we never want to see that, so that's why a safety car was deployed. Then again on lap 18, yet another safety car was deployed, but this time it was because of Isaac Hadjar actually crashed into the back of Antonelli as there was heavy spray coming up from the cars in front of him, and he just could not see Kimi in front of him until it was too late. Now, Hadjar's weekend was over straight away, then and there. We even saw from Hadjar's onboard, his car was just fucked. It was just completely smashed up. But the crash itself will be, or is, don't know if anything's been announced for it yet, but it's under investigation by the stewards, but they will have to look at that after the race. But even from the onboard cameras, because the weather was so bad, would it not just be chalked up to a racing incident? If the driver can't fucking see in front of him, it's not exactly his fault if he crashes into somebody. That's just shit. That's shit happens, I guess. It's just racing in bad weather. Then just after the safety car ended, following on Hadjar's crash, now Max Verstappen, you see him kind of accelerate to trying to keep up with the pack. He did manage to spin out. Luckily, he didn't contact anything, didn't hit anyone, didn't go into the gravel, anywhere near the barriers, but it did drop him back down to P10. Now, from Piastri's point of view, this is probably one of the more controversial calls during the race weekend, but we'll kind of dive into why it wasn't kind of controversial. But he did end up receiving a 10-second time penalty for a safety car infringement, where he caused hard braking, and it caused Max to kind of have to move out of the way, and he did ended up getting in front of him. Now, under the regulations, what's considered hard braking is kind of maxed out of like at 30 psi of brake pressure. Then we later found out that Piastri's brake pressure was measured at 60 psi, which you can even say that's just double what the regulations call for, or what's considered hard braking. Then there's not only the kind of brake pressure in terms of its psi, but it was also noted that he had dropped over 100 miles an hour during that brake infringement. So he went from whatever he was doing, 160, 170, down to 60 or 70 miles an hour. I'm surprised Max didn't smash straight into the back of him. Now, it is understandable why Piastri would be annoyed during that call, because it did lose him the race. He was going to win the race if he didn't get that 10-second penalty. But evidence is evidence. You can't hide from that evidence. And he did, in fact, break the rules, and he was punished accordingly. Then after all the kind of incidents that happened at the start of the race, once we kind of got into normal racing during Silverstone, or at Silverstone, actually Antonelli had to be told to come back into the pits once the safety car had ended, as his car was too badly damaged with that contact with Hadjar. So Mercedes just ended up retiring the car from the race. So that is going to do us for our home race, or the British Grand Prix, and it unfortunately comes to an end this year. But for the first time, Lando Norris wins his home Grand Prix in Silverstone. Now, he was followed up on the podium by Piastri in P2, marking it as a McLaren 1-2. But regardless if it was his first win at home or not, he wasn't the star of the show. Now, I have to say a massive, massive congrats to Nico Hülkenberg. For the first time in his Formula 1 career, and after 239 starts, he finally stands up on the podium in P3. Now, Nico, let's fucking go, lad. Congrats, you drove a hell of a race, and hopefully we'll be seeing you a lot more up on the podium, either with Sauber or next year with Audi. But either way, let's fucking go, lad. Good job. And that will do us for this week's episode of the Bells Club podcast. I want to thank you all for listening to this week's episode. And if you feel like you've enjoyed, please feel free to follow us here on wherever you get your podcasts. And I would normally say I look forward to talking to you all next week, but it'll not be next week. It'll be towards the end of July for round 13 or the Belgian Grand Prix. Goodbye, everybody.